Good morning, and welcome to this session on the rise and fall of nations in an era of global transformations. I am Yusun Chang, professor of economics at Indiana University. I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. We are honored to have Professor James Robinson at University of Chicago, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics last year, along with his longtime collaborator, Darren Acemoglu, for their groundbreaking research on the causal relationship between political systems and a country's long-term economic performance. James has had a fascinating intellectual journey. He received his undergraduate degree from the London School of Economics, a master from Warwick, and his PhD from Yale University. He was trained as an economist, but moved into political science, teaching at University of Melbourne, University of Southern California, Berkeley, and Harvard before his current interdisciplinary role at University of Chicago. He's a university professor at Harris School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science. He often described himself as a recovering economist, though he just won Nobel Prize in economics. So clearly, he retains that economist's analytical rigor. James is the author of two hugely influential books that help us understand our current moment. The first book, Why Nations Fail, shows that inclusive institutions lead to prosperity, while extractive institutions result in failure. And therefore, institutions, not culture or geography, determine whether countries prosper. The second book, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, explains how liberty emerges from delicate balance between state power and societal strength. And that when this balance collapses, societies tend toward authoritarian or anarchy. Today, he will present insights from the second book, The Narrow Corridor, telling us how liberty emerges from the delicate balance between state capacity and power of citizens, and how that balance can be lost. As for me, as I say, I'm the professor of economics at Indiana University. I think I also have an interesting academic journey, though not as remarkable as James. I was initially trained as a theoretical econometrician, but now mainly focus on applying my method to practically relevant areas, including intergenerational mobility, and James started with Stephen Dunlop. James is a colleague at Harris School of Public Policy. And I also study income and wealth inequality and monetary and fiscal policy interactions. Actually, I will be presenting my research on the effect of monetary and redistributive policies on income inequality here at the conference tomorrow. This connects directly to James's framework because inequality, as a failure of sharing prosperity, can undermine the very liberal democratic institutions that James studies. Our session is organized as follows. James will first present his framework for 20 minutes, then he and I will have a dialogue for 20 minutes, exploring how his ideas apply to Korea and to current global challenges we face. Finally, we will open for audience Q&A for the remaining time. James, the floor is yours.
Okay, marvelous. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm super happy to be here. Ooh, okay, right. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes. Let me talk for about 10 minutes about the framework in my book, The Narrow Corridor, and then I was tasked to applying it to thinking about the kind of challenges, shall I say, in the world today. What does it say about the situation in the world today? Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do. So the way we kind of introduce the book is to talk about liberty. And so here's two kind of claims, okay, two empirical claims. One comes from the John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which is a kind of universal claim, which I'll come back to right at the end with the last slide, which is that humans want to live in liberty. What did John Locke mean by that? Well, you could call this negative liberty. Okay? He called liberty a state of perfect freedom, where people are in a state of freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they see fit, without asking leave or depending on the will of any other man. So this would be a definition of negative liberty. People aspire to that. You could say that's a kind of empirical claim. We could argue about it, but we can discuss that. Okay? So whether or not that's true, I think we can agree with the second claim, probably much less contentious empirically, which is there's an awful lot of variation in the world in the terms of, to what extent do people live in that sort of liberty. Whether you like it or not, you can see there's a lot of variation. So our theory is trying to think about where does that variation come from. Okay? So let me sort of jump straight into that and say, okay, there's variation in liberty in the world. What could create variation in liberty? Okay? And I think the first case that usually jumps into people's minds when you start talking about this is a situation where when the state dominates society, that tends to be a situation where there's illiberty according to this definition. Okay? So, when George Orwell wrote his great book, 1984, he said, Big Brother is watching you. It wasn't technologically possible for Big Brother to watch you in 1948 when the book was published, but now it is. Okay? So, if you go in Tiananmen Square, Big Brother is watching you. Okay? So, this seems to be a situation where there's illiberty according to John Locke's definition. Right? But, of course, the whole world isn't like that. In fact, I spent most of my time working in countries that are very different from China in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, where it's almost the opposite. Okay? So just to take a topical example, Yemen. Okay? So Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula, Big Brother is definitely not watching you in Yemen. In fact, it's almost the opposite situation. The state is extremely weak, almost non-existent in Yemen, but society is very powerful and very organized. Okay? So you could think of a sort of the polar opposite case, not where the state dominates society like in China, but where society dominates the state. Here's a picture of northern Yemen, where every boy has a dagger. The great German sociologist Max Weber said, the state is the entity that has the legitimate monopoly of violence in society. In Yemen, the state doesn't really have a monopoly of violence, legitimate or otherwise, but people have the legitimate right to use violence. Okay, so that's the polar opposite situation, but of course, that's also a situation where there's not much liberty in the sense that I defined, okay? That situation, the polar opposite situation, doesn't lead to liberty either. So it leads to something more like, what Thomas Hobbes described in his great book, Leviathan, as a state of kind of war. So what does lead to liberty? Well, now you can see that this looks pretty difficult to achieve. It's not true. You're not going to get liberty when the state dominates society, the polar opposite case where society dominates the state. So what we claim is that in the middle, where there's a kind of balance between the power of the state and the power of society, that's where what we call there's a narrow corridor, that's where liberty emerges. Okay? So we put this together in a diagram. On the horizontal axis, we have the power of society. On the vertical axis, we have the power of the state. You can have kind of two boundary equilibria. On the vertical axis, you could think of this, I motivated it by China, where the state dominates society. On the other axis, you could have a boundary equilibrium where society dominates the state. And in between, there's this sort of there's a basin of attraction where the state and society balance each other. Okay? And that's the claim. That's where liberty emerges and other things too. Okay? So that's the sort of framework we developed. Okay? So here, I have some kind of the usual suspects. You could say in the corridor, we could talk about the emergence of liberty in Western Europe or North America historically, but since we're in Korea, let me talk about Korea, because you could put that up there and you could ask the question, well, the book kind of argues that for liberty to emerge, you have to sort of get into the corridor. You have to attain this balance between the state and society. Okay, so then the historical question is, well, why did some countries get into the corridor and other countries not get into the corridor? And how did Korea get into the corridor, for example? Okay, so let me talk about the Korean case. Okay, so in terms of that diagram. Well, if I thought about the history of Korea, and you could ask, okay, what about the nature of the state? How did the state relate to society? How was society organized? I think, modulo my ridiculously inadequate understanding of Korean history, you see it's a kind of mixed picture. If you go to the old imperial palace, just around the corner, there's a whole series of stones, you may have seen those, that mark how close could you come to the emperor depending on your social rank. Okay, so this was pointed out, this was the 9th, so there's a social ranking that allowed you to get closer or further away from the emperor. So this was a pretty sort of hierarchical state. Some of you may have noticed that I'm extremely interested in, particularly my 10-year-old son, Adrian, is particularly interested in K-pop demon hunters as a cultural and kind of social science phenomena. So I have to put up a photograph of that, the hat. There were sumptuary laws. Only elites could wear the hat. So that looks like a state pretty dominant in society, but there's other things about Korea that are interesting, like the Hunmoon, okay? So if you watch K-pop Demon Hunters, you know that it's a very sort of collectivist society. People are working together towards a collective goal. You may not have seen the social science aspect of this, but if you think about it, there's a collectivist aspect to Korean society that's very sort of interesting. So that's about the society and the cohesion of the society. You could say social capital. Think of the 1998 gold collecting incidents where Koreans came together and they gave their gold to kind of bail the state out. That's a strong society in our vision. Okay, so it's historically mixed, I would say. Okay, but I think for me the pivotal moment in the sort of emergence of modern Korea would be the 1940s, the 1950s, agrarian reform. So after the Second World War, there was this very radical agrarian reform. I don't have time to go through the numbers, but you can see here that 50% of land was owned by 4% of the landowners before agrarian reform. So that agrarian reform kind of creates a much broader basis for, I would say, an inclusive society in the 1950s. Okay? It's not just agrarian reform, there's educational reform. You can see if I went back to the 1950s, average years of schooling. This is, of course, the Barrow and Lee data set. Since we're here in Korea, I should be advertising the Barrow and Lee data set, very distinguished Korean economist. Back in the 1950s, educational attainment measured by average years of schooling was below the world average. Korea rockets up. It just overtook the United States. So there's an enormous expansion of education, kind of spreading human capital. So there's a big, I would think about this in terms of strengthening the capacity of society immensely. So if I was thinking about the historical dynamics of Korea, I think I would start in this period and say it's a bit unclear where Korea was with respect to the corridor historically, but at least in the 1950s, 1960s maybe, you see this, I would say, a dramatic increase in the power of society relative to the state. So Korea sort of gets into the corridor in the 1950s, 1960s, and then in the corridor, this dynamics happen, the interaction of state and society. That's what we call the Red Queen effect. And it's that dynamic that takes Korea up in the corridor, creating the economic miracle, creating the kind of social and cultural miracle as well. Okay? How do I know that? Well, a book that I enjoy very much by Professor Liu here sort of exactly is about this. Okay? Here's his chapter 6. Once in the corridor, he talks about generalized reciprocity between the strong state and the strong society. So that's exactly the dynamic in our book, the strong state and the strong society pushing each other and getting stronger in that competition. Okay. So that's, the Red Queen effect, that's this interaction between state and society which gets going in the corridor. Okay. I told a kind of historical story. You know, you could think of those conditions in Korea in the 1940s and 1950s. There was a lot of disruption, the end of Japanese colonialism, the Second World War, the Korean War. There was a sort of flux in which modern South Korea sort of emerged as a society. But I think if you look at the other historical accounts, you see that, you know, this may be difficult to attain. It may be difficult to get into the corridor. If I thought about the Chinese case, and I went far enough back in history, you could sort of say, well, how come China didn't go along that road? You know, if you go far back enough in history, you see all sorts of interesting things. This is from the Hunzi, a famous philosophical tract, and here's the translation of the characters. The king is a boat. The common people are the water. The water holds up the boat. The water sinks the boat. So there's an image of a kind of interaction between the state and society, the water and the boat, kind of in balance. If the boat gets out of control, you know, the water sinks the boat. Okay, so there's if I go back far enough, a few thousand years, 2,500 years, 3,000 years, there's sort of a balance between state and society. But then what happens in China, of course, is a new model takes over. A new model gets traction, famously associated with the legalist philosophers. His Shang Yang, very different image appears. When the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state that possesses the way strives to weaken the people. Okay? And that's sort of the way it's been in China for the last 2,500 years. Currently, the state is weakening people through something called the social credit system, micromanaging everyone in society. Okay, and I think when you see the Chinese dynamics, from the perspective of our book, you sort of understand the Yemenese dynamics. Like, how come Yemen created a society like that? Or why is it that so many parts of the world, the society dominates the state? Well, you can see that, and this is the argument in the book, it's somehow the anticipation of the type of mechanisms that set in China is what traps you into this other equilibrium where the society dominates the state. It's very hard to create a state and control it. That the genius of the dynamics in the corridor is you gradually build a kind of more effective state, a more powerful state, but you do it in a way that it can be controlled in the interests of society. Okay, all right. Economic implications, I'm not going to talk too much about that. As the professor was saying, I describe myself as a recovering economist. But for those of you who've read Why Nations Fail, it's in the corridor in some sense that these, what we call inclusive economic institutions and economic prosperity emerges. And perhaps we'll talk about that in the Korean case in the discussion. Okay, let me put the theory to work, in these times of crisis. Okay, I don't need to elaborate for Koreans that expression. Okay, and we do that a bit in the book in chapter 13, which we call Red Queen out of control. Okay, so what do I mean? What do we mean by Red Queen out of control? Well, if you look at history, it's clear that there were societies that were in the corridor for quite long periods of time that jumped out of the corridor. Right. So we try to understand in that chapter what was going on in those cases. Okay, and we make a few sort of generalizations about what circumstances lead the Red Queen to get out of control, meaning you're in the corridor, you're moving forward, states and society are getting more powerful together, but then something happens and you jump out of the corridor. Right? So the first generalization that you can see from these historical cases we could look at is society becomes very polarized. Okay, so social polarization, this is what something we call the zero-sum Red Queen, emerges. Okay, so you'll forgive me if I talk about US data, but we have a lot of polarization in the United States at the moment. So this is some data from the Pew Research Center about the attitudes of Republicans to Democrats and Democrats to Republicans. And it's mostly about Republicans say Democrats are more what? Closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, and the other way around. So what you see in this picture is there's enormous polarization in the sense of stereotypes spreading about your political opponents. So Democrats are more and more having negative opinions about Republicans and vice versa. And this has got enormously worse over the last 10 years. Okay, so one could look at polarization in many other ways. You know, this is from also from the Pew research, just kind of, you know, doing a word count of just, you know, asking people how they would discuss US politics, how they think of US politics, and you can see one of the most common words that people use in the United States now to talk about politics is divisive, corrupt, messy, polarized, there's polarized, bad. Okay, so this is just unprompted how people talk about the political situation. Okay, so there's polarization for you. What we also observe in these cases is that institutions become really incapable of solving problems and resolving conflicts. Okay, so could that apply in this case? Absolutely. So here's more data from the Pew research, which is just a survey where they asked people about, you know, do you think that most elected officials care about a person like you? And what the data says, on average, and this is true across genders, age, race, whatever, about 85% of people say that elected politicians don't care about somebody like me. Okay, so that's absolutely breathtaking. 85% of people say that elected politicians don't care about them. Okay, so it's hard for institutions to manage conflicts in this when there's so little trust in them. That's only one of many institutions, of course, but you know. And the third thing we point out third thing we point out is that then a crisis comes, a shock comes. Okay, so you have these three. This is just very kind of inductive. There are three things seem to happen. Okay, I don't think there's a crisis in the world at the moment. There's certainly not an economic crisis, but there is long-run structural problems. So the most obvious thing one could talk about from the economic perspective is just the failure of real wages of non-college educated workers to increase for the last 50 years. So this is just data from David Autor, the MIT labor economist. And you know, the big fact here is that if you don't have a college education, your real wages are lower than in the United States. Your real wages are lower than they were 50 years ago. Okay, so there's been a lot of growth over that period, a lot of technological change, everything else, but non-college educated people have not benefited. So there have been slow-moving underlying economic problems that are somehow associated with the problem here. But I don't think this is just about economics. You know, it's also about an ideological crisis. For me, the crisis is ideological, not economic. And you can see that in lots of ways. You know, since we were educated at Yale, I'm not sure if you ever read this book, but in 1951, William Buckley Jr., who was one of the sort of founders of modern American conservatism, studied at Yale, and afterwards he wrote this book called God and Man at Yale about how Yale professors were a bunch of kind of communist, atheist communists, you know. So this antagonism towards the liberal establishment. So for me, it's a kind of ideological crisis about the whole kind of modern liberal society. Okay, so last slide. So I would say, you know, where are we now? The good news is that at least what's happened in the United States, in some sense, is a kind of democratic backlash against many of these problems. The bad news is it's a very uninstitutionalized backlash because the institutions don't inspire confidence. So when the institutions don't inspire confidence, then there's a lot of scope for a non-institutional solution to problems, okay? So I would say, you know, just to conclude, you know, there's a lot to talk about. It's a very perilous moment in world history for someone like me whose work has been about the role of institutions and the importance of institutions in prosperity and promoting liberty. I think my role is to keep on reminding people of the overwhelming evidence about how important institutions are. But I think we also have to do that in a case where we can be honest and think hard about what the problems with the current system, the current global equilibrium, what the problems are. Okay, great, thank you. Where do I go? Here.
Thanks so much about your great presentation. You clearly talk about both, promise and the fragility of this liberty through the narrow corridor. So just to understand the framework, So basically, we are starting from the assumption that we all want to have a liberty, right? And then the liberty can be maximally achieved if we're in that narrow corridor.
Yeah.
You explain nicely, but it's hard to get in, and it's even harder to stay in that corridor. So then for us to be there, as you said, we have to be both the state and the society have to get stronger. Then for us to achieve that, we need to have a good mobilization of society. And for that, we need also a good liberal democracy and institutions. And as a consequence, we're going to have prosperity, right? The economic prosperity. So how to get into corridor is really important. And for that, democratic institutions, we have to have those institutions. And for that, we need the people's support. And then for people will be, if they want to support this democratic system, we have to deliver what they want. For instance, economic growth and good public goods like good healthcare and educations, and also good law and regulations, so that we can watch out for dictators and the mega rich people.
Yeah.
But then also gave us a lot of useful fact about incredible amount of distrust in government right now, which really undermines. How likely do you think is that the U.S., the most exemplary nation in the corridor, can exit out of this corridor? How likely do you think it is?
I don't have probabilities on that. I think.
But then, what kind of warning signs do you care?
Well, I think it is a warning. I think it's a wake-up call. I think what we've seen in the United States in the last decade is that there's an enormous amount of discontent in society, which has been kind of papered over for years. Many of these processes have been going on for decades and decades, and the political class was either unaware of them or just incapable of doing anything to address them. So I think I can't really speak to that, but I do think it's a big wake-up call, and I think that's a possibility for reorganizing many things and rebalancing relations and recognizing that other people's opinions are maybe legitimate and worth discussing instead of dismissing. And so I think it's a moment where, of course, there's a lot of conflict and uncertainty at the moment, but the optimistic side is, it's a moment where there's an opportunity to kind of reboot a lot of things, and they needed rebooting. Many things needed rebooting in the United States.
I think one of the reasons why people are questioning the democracy in the US is they think that you probably don't need democracy for economic growth. I guess they're thinking about China, for instance. Under this authoritarian government, they're doing extremely well. So people might think that democracy is not tackling the economic challenges they face. So that could be. But then we know, and you and Darren studied that it's really the democracy is actually doing pretty well, right?
Yeah.
So economic growth achieved without this social and democratic institution may not last.
Exactly.
Right? Because they don't invest in the public goods, education, and healthcare. So from very simple economic reasoning, we don't have good labor, good educated labor, so economy cannot thrive. So I think it's relevant for us. Like in Korea, we are in the middle of China and the US, and fortunately, we are in the narrow corridor, but how we should navigate in this very difficult situation between the China and the US?
Well, I suspect Korea is very good at navigating. That's what you've been doing ever since. You've been doing that for 70 years. I remember the first time I came to Korea, I was here with my friend Duol Kim, who pointed out, he took me to the Imperial Palace and he pointed out, oh, there's a Starbucks, that sign means there's a bomb shelter. There's a bomb shelter underneath the Starbucks. Like, oh, we don't have that in Chicago, So I think, South Korea's flourished in this immensely kind of challenging geopolitical context. Maybe it's partly a stimulant, but you have to live up. You have to kind of face up to that. So I think that's not news to you. The world is a challenging place. That's not news to you. In fact, historically it was probably even more challenging. So I think that I think on democracy, the research that we've done, the evidence is overwhelming that democracies invest more in public goods, there's more better educational attainment, there's less conflict and violence, there's higher rates of economic growth. But of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity between non-democracies. There's many different sorts of non-democracies. But my view, on China, which you expressed very well, is, this again, you could say, this is I started by talking about liberty and whether there are sort of universals of human society. Of course, that's why South Korea is so nice, because you did create this very vibrant democracy. You did create a lot of liberty here, and you see all the economic benefits from that. But you could say, is that really a human universal? My view on China is power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think maybe China's different, and there's other mechanisms, but I don't see any evidence to make me change my mind on that.
Yeah, I guess always the challenge is an opportunity for us to be creative. And I think one other reason, one of the reasons why the democracy is struggling these days is the inequality, I think. Because the fruit of this liberty and democracy is the prosperity, right?
Yeah.
And inequality means we are not really sharing the fruits. So I think in some ways we really have to do. In Korea too, we have a lot of inequalities. 벼락거지. I think the Koreans will know there are a lot of resentment about those, and especially the housing is a big issue. So I think to really navigate. So I think I'm asking you for you to focus on these inequalities.
Yeah.
In some way, in what ways we may be creative in this situation.
No, that's the inequality story is sort of implicit in that data on wages I put up there. But I think the problem in many democracies is that they've been immensely successful, but the world changes. Technology changes, computers diffuse, the world becomes far more globalized. There's structural changes, and you have to adapt to that. And democracies have not adapted to that. They haven't adapted to changes in the labor market, or many of these things that have changed the wage structure and have been associated with enormous increases in inequality, and they haven't adapted to that. Of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Sweden adapted better than Britain or the United States did. But I think that's so. Institutions are never kind of set once, and then never. You always have to adapt. You have to change, and I think that's why when I'm talking about rebooting, that's a lot of what I mean. We need new ideas for how to reinstitutionalize this liberal democratic system to try to deal with some of these problems. I think the Korean case. It depends on what data you look at. It's interesting that if you look at many measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, for example, or even the share of national income accruing to the richest 10%, then Korea has managed to implement this transformation with very little change in inequality. It's dramatically different from China, for example, because China started with socialism or whatever, so the initial conditions were different. But what you do see in Korea in the last couple of decades is the very top, like the 1% or the 0.1% have got a lot richer in Korea in the last 20 years. So you don't see it in many measures of inequality, which is kind of extremely interesting. But now you do see it right at the top. I think that's got something to do with globalization. It's got to do with many of these mechanisms like CEO pay. You're competing, in this global market for talent, in the business world. If you want to attract people or keep people, then you have to pay these enormous sort of salaries. So Korea can't isolate itself from that. But I think if I stood back and asked how has Korea managed this transition, in this inequality space, I'd say actually it's done much better than most societies.
Yeah, I think as you said, it's very heterogeneous. I think the situation in Korea is very uniquely different from other countries, especially we heard a lot about this housing situation, and a lot of wealth is concentrated. Therefore, the monetary policy and fiscal policy that affects, capital gain taxes or the tax on wealth it's all very delicate, and it has potentially, aggravate already, those populistic movements. So the civil movements may not be really in the interest of nation. It might be in the interest of those groups they are representing. So that's why I was, the most important movements, right? We need the social mobilization, but that mobilization may, in this kind of situation, may turn into something that could destabilize
Yeah,
instead
but
of
if you thought about the recent history of Korea, there's been social mobilization that protected the democracy against the declaration of martial law. So that's a pretty functional type of social mobilization, I would say. Yeah.
Yes. Well, given the time, I will ask you the last question. I know even though you got the Nobel Prize, I understand that you don't have answer for everything, but there is a big elephant in the room for Koreans, right? North Korea. So obviously North Korea is not in the corridor. In what ways do you think, whether it's possible, and if yes, what's the path for North Korea to get into corridor? You think?
Yeah. Well, I guess this comes back to my claim about, human universals in the sense that, my view, at least wherever I've worked anywhere in the world is, people are, humans, we share this deep kind of ancestral history. And, so my view is that people value liberty wherever they are, and the problem in North Korea is that the regime won't give people liberty. So I think, I think what's fascinating about North Korea is, you see what's happened in China, for example, you see what's happened in Vietnam. They made these sort of transitions. They created an enormous amount of wealth. The North Koreans know that's happening, and they don't do it. They still don't do it. So why is that? Because the regime is much more personalized. It's not institutionalized in the way of the Vietnamese regime or the Chinese. So they're too worried about losing power if they change. So I don't think the North Korean regime is going to change. The only way it's going to change is if people rise up and overthrow it, or it engages in some ludicrous interstate warfare and is defeated. Many regimes like that lose power as a consequence of warfare. But I think that's why they sound a lot, they talk a lot, but actually they don't do anything because they actually understand that's one of the things that could really imperil the regime. So I think it's a very difficult situation. It's absolutely devastating for the ordinary person in North Korea to live, in that world. But I think that's, I think there's, and what's the chance that such an event will happen? I have no idea, but the world is full of surprising events. I was a student when the Soviet Union collapsed, and nobody predicted that. I had friends who were training to be Sovietologists, and they didn't know it was going to happen. So maybe, something exciting will happen in North Korea.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, thank you for trying to give an answer to this hard question. So with that, James, your framework, I think it's fascinating, really giving us a way to understand what's going on here, what's happening, why we are facing, what's happening now and the way forward. I think especially the narrow corridor framework is really fitting in these circumstances of challenging, especially the times where this democracy is getting a lot of challenges left and right. So I think we should really keep going and should try to keep a balance between the state and society power, and so that we keep constant vigilance and balance. So now with that, we can close our discussion and open the floor for the audience questions. So please, if you have questions, let us know.
Thank you. Curious, you presented the data about real wage change and also this picture of growing distrust in educational institutions. And one might think that if you see that wages will only grow for folks who are more educated, there would be a drive towards education. What do you think creates that sort of unconventional response, or how do we address the tension between education as a solution, potential solution, and this clear driver that is antagonistic towards the institutions of education?
Well, it's more about access to education and, or attitudes towards education. I think also, Michael Sandel, if you've read the political philosopher Michael Sandel's book on the tyranny of meritocracy, Michael has this idea of, people talk a lot about redistributive justice in the United States, but, what you really need is something like contributive justice, Like, I have a very good friend who I went to college with in London, many years ago, who's a truck driver, okay? And he loves it. He loves being a truck driver. And so he could have gone a different job. He could have got a job in a bank. He could have become whatever. But he didn't. He wanted some space to do his own thing and whatever. And Michael Sandel's point is that's a contribution to society. We should respect that. Let's start. Before we start thinking about how we, solve this problem through education or whatever, let's stop thinking of the truck driver as the Harvard dropout and just respect their contribution to society. So I think that Michael's book is a very good place to start on that.
Well, thank you so much. With this, our time's up, so we'll conclude this session. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, James, particularly.
Okay.
Thank you.